All right, let's go. Number 10, the Dorchester pot. In June of 1852, in the town of Dorchester, Massachusetts, a crew of workmen detonated a charge of black powder against an outcropping of Precambrian rock on Meeting House Hill. The blast was routine. The sight was unremarkable. What the workmen pulled from the rubble afterward was neither. Embedded in the broken stone was a bell-shaped metal vessel, roughly 4.5 inches tall, dark pewter-gray, inlaid with delicate silvery engravings of vines and flowers. The metal was later identified as a zinc-and-silver alloy. The craftsmanship was fine. The botanical motifs were precise. The object resembled the work of a skilled metalsmith, trained in a tradition that valued small, ornamental ceremonial pieces. It resembled a candleholder. It resembled a pipe stand. It resembled, in every visible respect, an artifact of the 19th century. The rock it was found inside was estimated to be approximately 500 million years old. The discovery was not consigned to local rumor. The blast and the recovery of the vessel were documented in Scientific American in the same year. The notice was brief, almost matter-of-fact. The journal recorded the find without endorsement and without alarm, as though the contradiction the object presented were a minor curiosity rather than a problem in geology, archaeology, and the assumed architecture of human history. What makes the Dorchester pot particularly unsettling is not the alloy. It is the matrix. A bell-shaped vessel with floral inlays cannot have been manufactured by any civilization known to have existed 500 million years ago, because no civilization existed 500 million years ago. The Precambrian was a world of single-celled organisms and shallow microbial seas. There were no hands. There were no forges. There was no one to engrave a vine. The mainstream explanation, offered in the decades that followed, was that the vessel was a 19th century Indian or Middle Eastern object, most likely a pipe stand or candle holder, that had fallen into a fissure in the rock long after the rock itself had formed. The blast had broken open a cavity that already contained the object. The geological age of the surrounding stone was irrelevant. The vessel had simply found its way in. This explanation is plausible. It is also untestable. The vessel has been lost. The site has been built over. The Scientific American notice and a handful of later references are all that remain in the record. The object cannot be re-examined. The matrix cannot be re-examined. What remains is a paragraph in a 19th century journal describing a thing that should not have been where it was, and an explanation that asks the reader to assume the most ordinary possible chain of events to account for an entirely ordinary-looking artifact recovered from an entirely impossible location. The Dorchester pot was the first of these cases to enter the scientific press. It would not be the last. The pattern it established, an object out of its century recovered from a context that refused to permit it, would repeat across the next 100 years in places no one had thought to watch. Number 9. The London Hammer. In 1936, a couple named Max and Emma Hahn were walking near a small waterfall outside the town of London, Texas, when they noticed a piece of wood protruding from a rock. The wood was old. The rock was older. What made them stop was that the wood was clearly the handle of something, and the something was buried inside the stone. They took the rock home. They did not break it open immediately. It sat in their possession for nearly 3 decades before a member of the family finally cracked the concretion and revealed what was inside. The object embedded in the rock was a hammer, an iron hammer head, rust orange, attached to a blackened wooden shaft that had partially turned to a substance resembling coal. The surrounding matrix was a fossilized-looking gray stone, and the stone had grown around the tool the way bark grows around a fence post left too long in a forest. The hammer should not have been there. The rock, according to some sources, was identified as belonging to a geological formation more than 100 million years old, the Cretaceous period, the age of dinosaurs, long before any hand on this planet had wrapped fingers around a wooden handle, long before the smelting of iron, long before there was anyone to swing a hammer at. Anything at all. The artifact eventually found its way to the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas, where it has remained on display for decades, presented to visitors as a small, rust-stained anomaly that the conventional timeline cannot account for. Photographs of it have circulated for nearly a century. The hammerhead is unmistakably industrial. The handle is unmistakably wood. The stone around them is unmistakably stone. Skeptics have proposed a straightforward explanation, and the explanation is, in its own way, almost as strange as the alternative. They point out that mineral concretions can form rapidly under the right conditions. Calcium carbonate, dissolved in groundwater, can encase a modern object in what looks like ancient rock within decades, not millennia. The hammer itself, examined by metallurgists, shows characteristics consistent with 19th century American manufacture. The handle is wood. The head is iron. Both belong, almost certainly, to a miner or a settler who lost his tool in a creek bed sometime in the 1800s, and whose loss was then quietly entombed by the same slow chemistry that builds stalactites in caves. This is the mainstream view. It is, by any reasonable standard, the correct view. And yet, the hammer remains on display in Glen Rose, and visitors continue to make the drive to see it. Because what the London hammer demonstrates, regardless of its actual age, is how thin the line is between an ordinary tool and an impossible one. Drop a hammer in the wrong creek, wait long enough, and the earth itself will produce evidence that contradicts everything we know about when humans began to shape iron. The rock does not care what century the hammer was made in. The rock encases what falls into it, and the record, once formed, looks ancient to anyone who finds it later. Number 8. The Wolfsegg iron. In 1885, in the small Austrian town of Wolfsegg, a foundry worker named Riedel was breaking open a block of brown coal destined for the furnace when the block split and something fell out of it. The object that landed on the foundry floor was not coal. It was iron. It was small, dense, and dark gray, roughly 2.5 inches across, with a deep groove running around its middle. Its sides, as Riedel and his colleagues first described them, appeared to be nearly parallel, as though the object had been cut or cast rather than formed by any natural process. The coal seam from which the block had been extracted was estimated to be roughly 60 million years old. This is the part of the account that has refused to die for 140 years. The object came to be known as the Salzburg cube, though it is not quite a cube, and it does not come from Salzburg. It was sent first to a regional museum, where it was examined, sketched, photographed, and catalogued. It eventually came to rest at the Heimathaus Museum in Vöcklabruck, where it remains on public display. Visitors can stand in front of it. They can look at the groove. They can look at the parallel sides. They can read the placard, which does not entirely settle the question. The mainstream explanation, arrived at after more than a century of intermittent analysis, is that the object is a piece of cast iron, possibly a counterweight from old mining machinery, that fell into a fissure in the coal at some point in the 19th century and was subsequently encased by sediment and pressure. The cast iron hypothesis fits the metallurgy. The fissure hypothesis fits the geology. Together, they make the object ordinary. They make it explicable. They make it the kind of artifact that requires no rewriting of any textbook. What makes the Wolfsegg case particularly unsettling is not the iron. It is the pattern beginning to form behind it. Because this is now the second object in this list, discovered embedded in stone, far older than any human civilization. A hammer in Texas, a grooved iron block in Austria, both with mainstream explanations that depend on the same mechanism, that the surrounding rock formed recently around an ordinary object, or that the object fell into the rock through a crack no one observed, both with skeptical readings that depend on the rock being exactly as old as it appears. The geological record is, in theory, the most reliable archive humans have. It does not lie. It does not forget. It records, in sediment and pressure and the slow vitrification of organic material into coal, a sequence we can read with reasonable confidence. 60 million years ago, there were no humans in Austria. There were no foundries. There were no counterweights. There were no machines that could have produced an object with parallel sides and a deliberate groove. And yet the object exists. It is sitting in a museum in Vöcklabruck right now. The case has never been definitively resolved. The placard, by necessity, leaves the door open. 2 artifacts in. The pattern is beginning to assert itself. Number 7. The Koso artifact. In February 1961, 3 rockhounds named Wallace Lane, Virginia Maxey, and Mike Meixel were prospecting in the Koso Mountains near Olancha, California, searching for geodes to sell in their small gem shop. They had hiked into the hills that morning, expecting to return with the usual harvest of hollow stones lined with quartz crystals. They returned instead with an object that has been argued over for more than 60 years. The nodule looked, on the outside, like any other geode. Crusty, white-gray, unremarkable, the size of a fist. When Meixel cut it open the following day, the diamond saw did not pass through the crystal pocket they had expected. It struck metal. The blade was ruined. Inside the stone was a ceramic cylinder, porcelain white, wrapped around a metallic core. Around the cylinder ran what appeared to be a hexagonal sleeve, corroded but still recognizable. Rust-colored metal threads spiraled through the matrix where the saw had exposed them. The object resembled a spark plug. It resembled, specifically, a piece of early 20th century automotive hardware. And the rock it had been pulled from was, according to the initial assessment circulated in the years after the discovery, approximately 500,000 years old. This is the part that became famous. A manufactured component of a type that did not exist anywhere on Earth before the late 19th century, encased in a geological formation that predated human civilization by every order of magnitude that matters. The artifact was photographed, X-rayed, written about in fringe journals for decades. It became one of the foundational cases in the literature of out-of-place objects. It was cited alongside the Wolfsegg iron as evidence that the strata of the planet were not as sealed as geology insisted they were. The mainstream explanation arrived later, and it is, by the conventional measures, persuasive. The object has been identified by industrial historians as a champion spark plug of a model manufactured in the 1920s. The nodule surrounding it is not a geode at all. It is a corrosion concretion, a hardened crust of iron oxide and mineral debris that can form around buried metal in a matter of decades, not millennia. The white-gray exterior, so convincingly geological to the eye, is rust dressed in clay. The 500,000-year figure was never produced by a laboratory. It was an estimate, repeated until it acquired the weight of measurement. The Koso artifact, in other words, is almost certainly a spark plug that fell into the desert sometime between 1920 and 1940, was buried, and was found 4 decades later, wearing a costume made of its own decay. And yet the case has not died, and the reason it has not died is worth naming. The Koso artifact taught a generation of readers a specific shape of suspicion. It taught them that an object pulled from stone could look exactly like the impossible, while being, on inspection, merely the ordinary in disguise. It also taught them the opposite lesson, harder to shake, that the line between an ancient mystery and a modern misidentification is, in practice, the line between which expert was asked first. The rockhounds saw a geode. The geologists saw a concretion. The believers saw a visitor. The same object, examined by 3 different communities, produced 3 different centuries of origin. The pattern is becoming difficult to ignore. The objects keep arriving wearing the wrong era. Sometimes the era is too young. Sometimes it is too old. And sometimes, as in the case waiting next on this list, the strangeness is not where the object was found at all. It is what the object can do. Number 6. The Baghdad Battery. In 1936, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig was working at the National Museum of Iraq when he opened a wooden crate of artifacts recovered from a site near the city of Baghdad. Inside the crate was a small clay jar. The jar was unremarkable in size. It stood approximately 5 inches tall. It was terracotta colored, the soft orange-brown of fired Mesopotamian clay, the same color as 10,000 other vessels in the museum's collection. Koenig almost set it aside. Then he looked inside. Inside the clay jar was a copper cylinder. Inside the copper cylinder was an iron rod. The copper had corroded to a deep greenish patina. The iron had oxidized into rust, and the configuration of the 3 components, clay sheath, copper sleeve, iron core, did not correspond to any storage vessel Koenig had ever cataloged. It corresponded to something else. It corresponded to a device that would not be invented in Europe for almost 2,000 years. Koenig published his analysis in 1940. He proposed that the object was a galvanic cell, a battery. He proposed that the people who had assembled it, somewhere between 200 BCE and 250 CE, had understood how to generate electrical current using 2 dissimilar metals immersed in an acidic electrolyte. He proposed that they had been doing this in Mesopotamia approximately 17 centuries before Alessandro Volta announced the discovery of the electrochemical pile in the year 1800. The proposal was dismissed. The proposal has been dismissed, on and off, for the better part of a century. The mainstream consensus among archaeologists is that the Baghdad Battery is a storage vessel, a container for sacred scrolls, a reliquary. The copper cylinder held the parchment. The iron rod weighted it down. The clay sealed it from moisture. There is nothing electrical about it. There is nothing anachronistic about it. It is a filing cabinet. This explanation has one problem. The object works. Replicas of the Baghdad jar, constructed to its exact specifications and filled with an acidic liquid, vinegar, grape juice, lemon juice, anything the people of ancient Mesopotamia would have had within easy reach, produce approximately 1 volt of electrical current. This is not a theoretical claim. It has been demonstrated repeatedly in academic settings, in popular television experiments, on the program Mythbusters, in undergraduate physics classrooms. A clay jar built to 2,000-year-old specifications, filled with kitchen vinegar, will light a small bulb. It will electroplate a coin. It will deliver a measurable shock to a fingertip. The skeptics are not wrong that the object could have stored scrolls. The skeptics are wrong only in their certainty that storage was its only function. Because once a device is capable of generating current, the question of intent becomes secondary. The question of intent is a question for the people who made it. The question of capability is a question for physics. And physics has answered. What makes the Baghdad case particularly unsettling is not the object. The object is genuine. The object is ancient. The object is sitting in a museum, or was before the museum was looted in 2003 and the artifact's present location became uncertain. What makes the case unsettling is the shift it forces in the definition of anachronism itself. The Koso artifact, the Wolfsegg cube, the London hammer, these are objects that look wrong in their setting. The Baghdad battery looks correct. It looks like exactly what an ancient potter would have produced. It is only when you fill it with vinegar that the wrongness arrives, which raises a question the field has never satisfactorily answered. How many other ordinary-looking objects in the museum cases of the world are waiting for someone to fill them with the correct liquid? Number 5. The Voynich manuscript and the language that has never been spoken. In 1912, a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich purchased a small, unremarkable codex from a Jesuit college in Italy. It was the size of a modern hardcover book. It had 240 pages of vellum, soft to the touch. The ink faded to a brown, the color of weak tea. The illustrations were in watercolor, pale blues and muted greens, the pigments worn but still legible after centuries of handling. He took it home. He showed it to scholars. He waited for someone to tell him what it was. No one ever has. The manuscript has been carbon dated to the early 15th century, between 1404 and 1438. This part of the record is not contested. The vellum is genuine. The inks are period appropriate. The binding is consistent with the workshops of late medieval Europe. The object itself is not a forgery in any conventional sense. It is exactly as old as it appears to be. What is contested is everything written on it. The manuscript is composed in a script that resembles no known language. The characters flow with the confidence of a practiced hand. They are not random. They follow statistical patterns consistent with natural language, with word frequencies, with structural rules, with what linguists call entropy signatures that match real human speech. Whoever wrote this book was not improvising. They were writing fluently in something, and no one in 600 years has been able to say what. Cryptographers have tried. The greatest codebreakers of the modern era have tried. William Friedman, the man whose team broke the Japanese purple cipher during the Second World War, the man who effectively founded American cryptanalysis, spent decades of his life on the Voynich manuscript. He did not solve it. He concluded, near the end of his life, that the text was likely a constructed artificial language, but he could not prove it. He could not read a single sentence. He died with the manuscript still unbroken. The illustrations are stranger than the text. The pages contain drawings of plants that match no botanical species ever catalogued. Plants with roots like organs, leaves arranged in configurations not found in nature, flowers shaped like instruments. There are astronomical diagrams that resemble nothing in the medieval European canon, circular charts dense with symbols, suns, and moons in arrangements that no contemporary astronomer would have drawn. There are pages of nude figures, mostly women, standing in green pools connected by an elaborate plumbing of tubes and channels, as though bathing in a system whose function the manuscript treats as self-evident and the modern viewer cannot recognize at all. The manuscript is now held at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. It has been photographed in high resolution. It has been made available to any researcher in the world. It has been fed into artificial intelligence systems trained on every known language and every known cipher. The systems have produced nothing. The patterns are there. The meaning is not. The mainstream view is that the manuscript is a constructed language, an elaborate hoax, or a cipher whose key has been lost. Each of these explanations accounts for part of the evidence, and none of them accounts for all of it. A hoax of this length, sustained across 240 pages with internal statistical consistency, would itself be a feat of intellectual labor no medieval forger has ever been documented to attempt. A cipher whose key has been lost should, in principle, still yield to modern computational attack. It has not. What makes the Voynich case particularly unsettling is not the language, it is the implication, because the manuscript is not an object that does something impossible. It is an object that records something. It is a transmission. Someone, in the early 15th century, wrote down 240 pages of information that the receiving civilization, ours, cannot decode. The information is sitting in a library in Connecticut. It is waiting. And the strangeness is no longer in the object. The strangeness is in the pattern the object contains. The pattern we can see, can measure, can confirm is meaningful, and cannot read. Number 4, the Antikythera mechanism and the gear that should not exist. In October 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers, sheltering from a storm near the small island of Antikythera, descended to the seafloor and found a Roman-era shipwreck. Among the marble statues, the amphorae, and the corroded coins, they recovered a lump of bronze and wood so encrusted with marine deposits that it was at first ignored. It sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for 2 years before anyone noticed what was inside it. When the lump cracked open, the curator who examined it saw something that did not belong in the 2nd century before the Common Era. He saw gears. The object has since been dated to roughly 100 to 200 BCE. It contains at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, cut to tolerances that no Mediterranean workshop of the period was believed to be capable of producing. The gear teeth are triangular, precise, and arranged in differential trains that allow the device to model the motion of the sun, the moon, and the known planets. It was used to predict eclipses. It was used to forecast astronomical positions decades in advance. It was, by every functional definition, an analog computer. It exists, and there is no debate about its authenticity. The corroded greenish bronze fragments, roughly shoebox-sized, sit today in climate-controlled cases in Athens. Examined by every imaging technology the present century has been able to bring to bear. The delicate inscriptions in ancient Greek, partially recovered through neutron tomography, describe the astronomical cycles the gears were built to track. The mechanism is real. The mechanism is ancient. The mechanism is exactly what it appears to be. This is what makes the Antikythera case the most important object in the catalog. The other artifacts on this list can be argued over. Their dates can be contested. Their provenance can be questioned. The Antikythera mechanism cannot be questioned. It is genuinely Hellenistic. It is genuinely Greek. It was genuinely built by hands that have been dust for 2,000 years. And nothing remotely like it appears again in the European record for 1,400 years. The complexity of the Antikythera gearing was not matched in Europe until the astronomical clocks of the 14th century. There is no transitional record. There is no lineage of slowly improving devices. There is no workshop tradition, no apprentice's first attempt, no clumsy precursor in a museum somewhere showing how the craftsman got there. The mechanism appears in the archaeological record fully formed, sinks into the Mediterranean, and the capacity to build it vanishes with it. For 14 centuries, no one in Europe builds another. Then, in the late medieval period, someone does, and the device is celebrated as a marvel of new invention. The unsettling aspect of the Antikythera mechanism is not that it is too advanced for its era. It is that we already know, with certainty, that it is not too advanced for its era. Someone in the Hellenistic world built it. Someone designed it. Someone calibrated the gear ratios against centuries of recorded astronomical observation. The capacity existed. The knowledge existed. The hands existed. And then the capacity disappeared. The knowledge disappeared. The hands disappeared. An entire technological tradition was lost so completely that when historians first proposed, in the early 20th century, that the device on the museum shelf in Athens was what it appeared to be, they were dismissed for decades as fantasists. The mechanism was simply assumed to be misdated. It could not be what it was. It was what it was. The warning, if there is one, is not about visitors from the future. It is about visitors from the past. It is the demonstration in corroded bronze that civilizations forget, that entire categories of human capacity can be built, used, mastered, and then erased, leaving behind a single object that nobody knows how to read. Number 3, the Renaissance cell phone paintings and the gestures that should not exist. In the 1480s, the Florentine painter Domenico Ghirlandaio completed a small devotional work depicting the Madonna with the infant Saint Giovannino. It is, in most respects, an unremarkable piece of late 15th century religious art. Faded fresco pigments, gold halos, the familiar arrangement of mother, child, and attendant saint that any Florentine workshop of the period could have produced on commission. The painting hung in private collections for centuries without attracting unusual attention. It was studied by art historians. It was cataloged. It was reproduced in textbooks on Quattrocento devotional painting and filed away as a competent example of its school. Then, in the early 2000s, the painting appeared on the internet. It appeared with a specific claim attached. In the upper portion of the composition, behind the Madonna's shoulder, a man stands looking up at the sky. In the sky above him, there is a figure that some viewers came to describe as a disc-shaped craft. The man is shielding his eyes. He appears, to a viewer trained on the imagery of the late 20th century, to be witnessing something he cannot identify. The image went into wide circulation under the heading of a Renaissance UFO sighting. It has remained in circulation ever since. This is not the only painting of its kind. A small but persistent body of internet lore has compiled images from medieval and early modern art, alongside ancient carvings and petroglyphs from cultures across 3 continents, in which figures appear to be holding small, dark, rectangular objects to their ears or before their faces. The objects, in the language of the lore, are described as cell phones. The figures, in the language of the lore, are described as time travelers caught in the act. The mainstream view of these images is not contested. The rectangular objects in Renaissance paintings are prayer books, hand mirrors, or symbolic devotional items whose meaning was immediately legible to a 15th century viewer and is no longer legible to us. The figure in the sky behind the Ghirlandaio Madonna belongs to a long iconographic tradition of divine presence rendered as luminous form. The petroglyphs depict ceremonial implements whose function has been lost. The phenomenon at work is not time travel. It is pareidolia, the brain's pattern recognition imposing the familiar on the unfamiliar. The modern eye reaching backward and finding its own reflection in surfaces that were never meant to hold it. This is almost certainly the correct explanation, and it is, for that reason, the more disturbing one. Because what the Renaissance cell phone paintings demonstrate is not that travelers visited the 15th century. They demonstrate that we can no longer look at the past without seeing ourselves in it. The objects in those hands changed meaning the moment the iPhone entered the average pocket. The figure in the sky changed meaning the moment the first photograph of a flying disc appeared in an American newspaper. The record itself did not change. We did. And the warning embedded in that fact is not about the Renaissance. It is about whatever lens we are not yet wearing, the one through which our own century will be read. Number 2, the 1928 Chaplin footage, and the woman who was already speaking. In 1928, Charlie Chaplin released a film titled The Circus. The film itself is unremarkable for our purposes. The footage that has become unremarkable is a bonus feature attached to a later home release, a brief clip shot at the Los Angeles premiere, showing members of the public arriving at the theater. The footage sat in archives for over 80 years, watched by no one outside the small circle of Chaplin historians for whom such material is routine. In 2010, an Irish filmmaker named George Clark released an analysis of the clip that propagated across the internet within days, and within weeks had been examined by archivists, costume historians, and forensic image analysts on 3 continents. What Clark had noticed was a woman. She appears for approximately 6 seconds. She is elderly. She is wearing a dark fur coat, cut in the style of the late 1920s. Her hat is pulled low over her brow in the manner of women of her generation. She walks past the camera with the steady, unhurried gait of someone who has not yet been told that cameras matter. In her right hand is a small, dark, rectangular object, which she holds pressed against the side of her face, obscuring half of it. Her lips are moving. She is speaking. She is speaking into the object. The footage is genuine. This is not in dispute. It has been examined by analysts who specialize in detecting modern interpolation, in identifying period-inappropriate film stock, in catching the small inconsistencies that distinguish doctored footage from original negatives. It has survived every test. The clip is from 1928. The woman is from 1928. The object in her hand is in 1928. The cellular network did not exist in 1928. The first cellular call would not be placed until 1973, 45 years after this woman walked past the camera on a Los Angeles sidewalk. The infrastructure required to support the gesture she is performing did not exist in any form, anywhere on Earth, until the second half of the 20th century. There was no tower for her signal to reach. There was no satellite. There was no network. There was, in 1928, no possible referent for the action she appears to be performing. Skeptics have proposed an explanation, and the explanation is sober and credible. They argue that the woman is holding an early portable hearing aid. Siemens did release such a device around that era. Hearing aids of the period required users to hold a small amplifier near the ear. This part of the explanation fits. The part that does not fit is the speaking. Hearing aids do not require the user to speak into them. The woman in the footage is not adjusting a device. She is not listening. She is talking with the unmistakable cadence of conversation, with the small pauses, and resumptions of someone receiving replies, into an object that has no plausible counterpart on the other end. She is performing, in 1928, a gesture that would not become a common human posture for 3 generations. What makes the Chaplin footage particularly unsettling is not the woman, it is the archive. The 20th century is the most densely photographed period in human history. Billions of frames, millions of hours. And inside that record, noticed by no one at the time, are figures performing actions that did not yet have meaning. The woman in 1928 was invisible until 2010 because no one before 2010 had the vocabulary to see her. What else, then, is already in the record? What are we walking past right now that someone in 2090 will finally recognize? Number 1. The South Fork Bridge photograph. In 1941, in the small mining town of Brelorne in British Columbia, Canada, a crowd gathered for the reopening of the South Fork Bridge. A local photographer documented the event. The photograph is unremarkable in every respect, except one. It shows a community of men and women in the standard dress of the period. Dark suits, hats pulled low, knee-length dresses, the formal posture of a small-town public ceremony in the early years of the Second World War. And in the middle of the crowd, looking directly at the camera, stands a man who does not belong in 1941. He is wearing what appears to be a modern hooded sweatshirt. He is wearing what appear to be wraparound sunglasses. He is wearing what appears to be a printed t-shirt with a graphic on the chest. He is holding what appears to be a compact handheld camera. His clothing, his posture, the casualness of his bearing in the middle of a formal civic occasion, all of it reads as a man who has wandered in from a different decade. He stands out from the figures around him, not subtly, but completely. The photograph is black and white. The era is unambiguous. The man does not fit. The photograph sat in private hands for decades. It was eventually donated to the Brelorne Pioneer Museum and placed on public display in a small exhibit about the history of the bridge. In 2010, a visitor took a digital image of it and posted it online. Within weeks, the photograph had circulated through every corner of the internet under a single description. The Time Traveler at the South Fork Bridge. The Brelorne Pioneer Museum has confirmed that the photograph is authentic. It is part of the official municipal archive. It has not been altered. It has not been retouched. The man in the hooded sweatshirt was present at the reopening of the South Fork Bridge in 1941, and he was photographed alongside the residents of a small Canadian mining town who had no reason to find him remarkable enough to mention. Skeptics have offered the conventional explanations. Sweaters with sewn-on logos existed in the 1940s. Wraparound sunglasses, in a primitive form, existed in the 1940s. Small Kodak folding cameras existed in the 1940s. Every individual element of the man's appearance can be matched, with effort, to something that was theoretically available in his era. The mainstream view is that he is not a time traveler. He is simply a young man dressed in a combination of items that, taken separately, were possible, and taken together, look impossible. This explanation is the one preferred by historians, and it may well be correct, but it does not resolve the photograph. It resolves only the question of whether the man could have existed. It does not resolve the question of why, in a photograph of dozens of people, he is the only one who looks like us. And this is the warning the entire pattern has been building toward. The artifacts that survive across centuries are not the ones their creators meant to send. The mechanism in the shipwreck, the hammer in the rock, the figure in the background of the Chaplin footage, the man at the bridge in 1941, none of them were addressed to us. They surfaced because the record is denser than the people who made it ever realized, and because anomalies, once embedded, do not decay at the same rate as the consensus around them. What you are looking at when you look at the South Fork Bridge photograph is the possibility that you are visible in someone else's archive right now. That a gesture you made this morning, a device in your hand, a posture you did not think twice about, has already been recorded and is already waiting to be noticed by an observer in a century that does not yet exist. The warning was never the artifacts. The warning was that we keep finding them, and we keep deciding not to look. If you want to see more videos like this, click the